Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. All right, so here we are for one more installment of Strange as It Seems. So to cut to the chase immediately, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, wait a minute. Just let me set the stage just for a moment. It's now the latter part of October, where we are in beautiful northern Idaho in this day. It is a windy, blustery, somewhat dark day. Fall has definitely set in. You know, the last hopes that summer would hang on indefinitely have once again vanished. We are in the full grips of autumn, and that means that around the corner is Halloween. And with that coming up, we thought we would have to do something kind of Halloween related. So our topic for today is witchcraft. That seems to be appropriate. It turns out that's a more complicated subject than one might think. It takes us beyond Margaret Hamilton and the Wizard of Oz, and it takes us beyond Elizabeth Montgomery and Bewitched. But witchcraft is, well, let's delve into that. But first, again, just to interrupt for a moment, I want to thank people who have sort of joined us and subscribed, thanks to Conrad Flynn. So any friends of Conrad Flynn, thank you for the Flynn effect, which has modestly but encouragingly boosted our numbers, and hopefully that will continue. So, witchcraft, a deep subject. And where to begin with that? Well, let's start with a witch story. And let's take one from American colonial history. And I know what people are thinking. Well, that's got to be the Salem witch trials. Yep, that's it. Think of witchcraft and the American colonies, and you've got the Salem witch trials. No, I'm not going to be talking about the Salem witch trials. Why? Because everybody else has talked about them, okay? Arthur Miller talked about them. There are plays written about it, movies written about it. It's been raked over ad nauseum. So no, we're not going to go there. We're not going to go to Massachusetts, and we're not going to go to the 1690s. So the Salem witch trials, to put things in perspective, are 1692-93. No, we're going to go back some 35 years earlier to a witch case that occurred in Long Island, New York today. What was then in 1658 and 59, when these events occur, was part of the Connecticut colony. So the other interesting thing about this case is that, what happens in the Salem witch trials is that accusations are leveled and people end up dead. And again, this is usually treated as a cautionary tale of how unsubstantiated rumors and personal vendettas can be turned into murderous public policy. The underlying assumption in most examinations of the Salem witch trial is that there is no actual witchcraft going on at all. Just hysterical teenage girls, victimized middle-aged women, and, of course, ignorant, powerful men in control of things, which is true, but it's not necessarily all of it. Now, we're going to be looking at something else. We're going to be looking at the case of Goody Garlick. Bet you never heard of her. Goodwife Garlick. She was a woman who lived in what was East Hampton, still around today, but was then the small village of East Hampton, Long Island, again part of the Connecticut colony. And in 1658, she would be accused of witchcraft. Now, the case in some way begins in February 1658. There was another younger resident of East Hampton by the name of Lizzie or Elizabeth Gardner Howell. And she was 16 years old, and she was dying. She had given birth some days before. She had developed postpartum infection. She was delirious. And on this particular frigid February night of 1658, she is screaming at something and pointing across her bedroom. She claims that she sees a figure, a dark, forbidding figure, crouched over at the end of her bed. Other people, including her father, are there, don't see anything. They ask her who she sees, and she says, "It's Goody Garlick. Goody Garlick has come here. She is the person who has put a curse on me. She's responsible for everything which has happened." And the following day, Elizabeth Howell died. Now, interestingly enough, her father, who, like virtually everyone else there, was a good Christian, good Puritan Christian for the most part, kind of took this in stride. It wasn't him who brought accusations against Goody Garlick. That was one of the other members of the community. He buried his daughter, accepted it as God's will, and basically moved on. But of course, the rumors then began. Actually, the rumors had already been going about Goody Garlick, and that there was something sinister at work. Black magic was afoot, and Goody Garlick was to blame. Now, a little explanation here about Goody Garlick's name. If you go back into this particular era, and also in England, let's say in the 17th century, you run across a lot of women. This confused me for a while, named Goody. Okay, good this, good that. And I thought, well, that must have been a very popular name. Well, it turns out that Goody is not a name. It's a title. And it's actually a nickname based upon the title, which is Goodwife. Oh. So Goody is Goodwife, and I thought, well, I could see if you're named Goodwife, where you might want to go by Goody, but even that is a title, and part of it is sort of class-based. It was Mrs. would be used for someone from a higher social station. Goodwife was a term that was used for a woman, the way that you would address a woman, usually from the middle, maybe lower middle class. It suggests something about social origins, and since people were addressed that way as a title, often that was simply abbreviated as Goody. Now, actually, the interesting thing is that Goody Garlick's actual name was Elizabeth.
Oh, okay.
Which is the same as the girl I was just talking about that died, that she supposedly used witchcraft to kill. So we can get a lot of Elizabeths running around. So just keep in mind, Goody Garlick is Elizabeth or Lizzie Garlick. And again, she and her husband, she's married, a woman probably of middle age by this point. And the town they live in is, well, I'm not sure you would want to glorify it with the name town. The village of East Hampton consisted of about 30 families. So maybe somewhere a couple of hundred people. And you might get the image that, well, they all lived out on Long Island in bucolic splendor and being all good Christians. They were always united in fellowship. No, that doesn't seem to have been it. Everybody in town hated each other. They were constantly suing each other. This is one of there were constant complaints of people against the other who argued that they had taken their land, or that they had changed boundary stones, or that there were disputes over money or cattle, whatever it might be. But it tended to be contentious. The town seems to have been full of people who were to one degree suspicious and angry at each other. And a good deal of that suspicion and anger focused on Goody Garlick and her husband because they were among the wealthier inhabitants. So you can kind of see what's happening here. It appears that people in town owed them money, okay, because they had more money. They were, I don't know, either they were extremely generous or they were loan sharks. But nevertheless, there was a good deal of resentment because there were a number of people in town who were indebted to them. They are also seen as putting on airs, thinking they were somewhat special. So it just naturally followed that Goody Garlick was a witch. So the rumors began to spread and the accusations were made. And the accusations themselves against Goody Garlick, again, didn't come from the family of the girl who died. They'd probably been floating. That was more of a catalyst to what had happened. But they actually came from another woman in town whose name was also referred to as Goody. Okay. Again, there are quite a few of these.
I think you can go with Elizabeth.
Goody Davis. Okay. I don't know what her actual first name was. But Goody Davis accused Goody Garlick of being a witch. Now, Goody Davis was also recognized within this divided and contentious and argumentative community as being an inveterate gossip and liar. Therefore, while she was making the accusations, she was a woman that basically no one else in town would really believe on the basis of this. So the accusations spread, and they eventually went back to Hartford, which was then basically the capital of, or the administrative center of the Connecticut colony. And the specific accusation that was made was that Goody Garlick had used witchcraft, or more specifically, the evil eye, looking with bad intention. Now, this is the whole idea. The evil eye is a kind of universal concept that you can, even in some cases, unintentionally cast an evil spell on someone just by looking at them with a bad attitude. You know, somehow your malicious intention is being communicated simply through the look. But that she was not just responsible for the death of Elizabeth Howe, but let's see, what other sorts of things she had done. She was accused of sickening and injuring various people and animals through the evil eye, and also by spells and potions that she concocted. For instance, she was accused of breaking an oxen's leg merely by looking at it. You know, just looked at the ox, leg collapsed, and that was it. On another occasion, she said that she had touched a newborn infant who soon sickened and died. Others claimed that Garlick controlled a host of animal familiars and that she practiced witchcraft back in Massachusetts, where she'd originally come from, and even her husband was involved in this as well. Now, a warlock. So they were involved in this as a couple. Now, again, most of these accusations went back to Goody Davis. Anybody else who was making these statements, they would all trace back that Goody Davis is the person that they had heard this from. So the question was, from the officials who came down to Hartford to look into it, is it possible? Now, was witchcraft, let's put it this way, was that a crime in the Connecticut colony? It was. And in fact, in recent years, 2 women in the colony had been put to death for witchcraft. So it was a crime. It did carry the most serious penalty, and that penalty was, at least on those 2 occasions, applied. So this was no mere formality. Goody Garlick could be killed as a result of this. But the basic determination was that there was no way that she was going to get a fair trial in East Hampton. That was it. There was everybody there disliked her. They might dislike her accuser, but they all disliked each other. This would be completely ridiculous. So instead, we're going to take her into custody, and we're going to take her back to Hartford, and we'll have a more thorough examination there. And if necessary, we will convene a hopefully more objective jury in Hartford. Now, the interesting thing is that her case went directly to the colonial governor, a fellow by the name of John Winthrop Jr.
Mm.
Now, John Winthrop Jr. viewed himself as a legal scholar. He also had some other interests. He was an alchemist. He was deeply interested in things metaphysical and occult. In fact, as one of his biographers put it, Winthrop spent his life seeking mastery over the hidden powers of the universe.
Mm.
So, did he delve into and practice what might be termed magic? Yes, he did. Hold that thought. Now that's interesting because he was acquainted with occultism.
Yeah.
And one of the things in Winthrop's opinion, after examining Goody Garlick, is that he viewed her as a woman who was simply too uneducated, too basically ignorant to have any real knowledge of occultism.
Mm.
You know, she might practice some kind of folk magic.
Yeah.
She might, crucify a toad or something, or come up with some spells or some kind of potions. But remember, in addition to being an alchemist and occultist, he was also a legal scholar. And he knew that the 1604 statute under which witchcraft could be punished in Connecticut only applied to conjuring. That's what the statute actually condemned as witchcraft. The conjuring of spirits.
So you could practice magic as long as it wasn't...
You could practice. So it said nothing about spells or potions or the evil eye. There was nothing in the statute that said just looking at someone with a bad intention and they died, even if that was true,
Yeah.
it was not provable in a court. So Winthrop looked over the case and decided that the law as it existed did not apply in this case because no one accused Goody Garlick of conjuring evil spirits. So he gave her a verdict of not guilty and sent her home. Now, a little detail here again is that in the legal terminology of the time, at least in the Connecticut colony, is that not guilty wasn't the same thing as being said that she was innocent. It didn't mean that the accusation against her had no basis. It didn't even mean that she wasn't responsible for the death of Elizabeth Howell or breaking the oxen's leg. It just meant that the law against witchcraft as it applied wasn't there, so she had not committed a definable crime. That's what a verdict of innocent would have said. Not guilty just meant that, well, maybe she did it, but we can't prove it. The law doesn't apply. So naturally, when she went back to East Hampton, was everybody there happy with the situation? No, especially Goody Davis, her accuser, was not happy at all. So what do you suppose might have happened then? Well, Goody Garlick and her husband immediately filed a defamation suit against Goody Davis, accusing her of causing all of these problems and seeking damages. They never collected them because 2 weeks later, Goody Davis just dropped dead.
Wow. Now,
Now, of course, did that further some suspicions in East Hampton that Goody Garlick was somehow... Now, of course, you're trying to sue this person to potentially get money out of them, so why would you then kill them? Now, certainly some people pointed that out. Unless, of course, the suit was just a cover for you killing them. So the suspicions against Goody Garlick never disappeared. And by the way, what happened to she and her husband? They lived into their 90s. They outlived everybody in town. Which, again, some people thought vaguely suspicious. So here's the interesting question here. What was actually going on? So I know that this was a community that was full of personal disputes and I mean, there's no great surprise that the accusation of witchcraft would come up against her. Nor, considering the law as it stood, there's no great surprise that she was essentially, the case was dismissed and she was sent home. Did she practice anything that might be sort of like home remedies of some kind? Was she a maker of potions. Maybe, but that again wasn't criminal under the case. So the interesting thing about Goody Garlick is that you can look at it in one of two ways. Either she was a completely innocent woman and there was no such thing as any form of witchcraft going on. It was all just a scurrilous accusation, and she was fortunate to have her case land in front of someone who was knowledgeable both to a certain degree about witchcraft, or at least about magic, and about the law, and her life was saved. Or was she a practicing witch who got away with it? And that one of the main reasons that she got away with it was that her case fell in front of another witch. That John Winthrop wasn't just the governor, and he wasn't just a lawyer, and he wasn't just an alchemist, that he himself was the chief warlock of Connecticut colony, and thus was protecting one of his own. So, one story, which you can read in different ways. But I thought this was an interesting way to sort of bring us into this kind of question, because it brings up the fundamental issue of the reality of witchcraft at all. Now, as many teenage girls of my past acquaintance would assure you, yes, witchcraft exists, and they were a witch. This becomes kind of a popular thing to do. And it's not just limited to adolescent females, but it does seem to have a particular attraction to young women of a certain age in order to see themselves as witches. I mean, who hasn't claimed that at one point or another, or aspired to it? But of course, there's another thing to actually be one. So there are kind of three different ways that you can look at witchcraft itself. One is that it simply doesn't exist. It never has existed. It's just a kind of inflammatory, pejorative accusation which is made always against women, particularly women that for other, Goody Garlick would be a case of this. She was a woman that a lot of people didn't like.
Yeah.
They had some kind of animus against her, and this became something to justify their hostility, that she is in league with the devil, and that she practices, she's a source of the evil eye, doing all kinds of unpleasant, infernal things. So it's just never there. It's always make-believe. There is no legitimate accusation of that. Now, the other view, the second one, let's say, and is that, yes, there are people who consider themselves witches, and they do practice something that they call witchcraft. You can argue whether this is folk magic or traditional remedies, or it's just alternative medicine. There are any number of things you could put on it. But the argument that there has never been any real substance, not just to the accusation of witchcraft, but to the existence of witchcraft, goes against the fact that lots of people seem to claim that title. There is a culture or a subculture which embraces that idea. Now, you can argue that people think they're witches, they're just not really doing anything. It's another sort of projection of a kind of fantasy. But when you get to the idea that there are witches, or at least there are people who believe they are, let's get to that point, and there definitely are, then are they good or bad? Because particularly in a more modern sense, you'll get the argument that witchcraft is nothing evil, is nothing diabolical about it. It's simply the continuation of an ancient female-centered religion. A religion older than Christianity or Islam, a religion which carries on tradition, a religion which is rooted perhaps in some kind of ancient, almost prehistoric, matriarchal society. So one of the things that certainly happened in the modern era is that witchcraft has become thoroughly feminized. I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing, but that is, it's thoroughly sort of female dominated. It's seen as a kind of female reign. The term witch itself inevitably conjures up
Yeah.
the image of a female. People do talk about male witches or warlocks, but they seldom really much come into focus, except in the movie Warlock, played by Julian Sands. They crop up every now and then, but it's largely seen as part of the feminine realm. And the argument, particularly popularized in modern witchcraft in the form of Wicca, we'll come back to that. Is that it always has been. It always has been part of this kind of matriarchal realm. Except no one, of course, can actually produce any documentation of one kind or another. There's no written history of witchcraft. It's supposedly just the continuation of ancient traditions. Is it? Well, again, we'll come back to that. But it's harmless. You know, it isn't to say that a witch couldn't use her powers to do an enemy harm, but only if they were out to get them, only in a kind of self-defense. In fact, there are some who will argue that the basic rule in witchcraft is that do no harm to anyone. All right. Do your will, but your will you shouldn't seek to actively harm. Doesn't mean you don't have the capacity to do that. It just means that you shouldn't, which always allows the fact that some people would. But that witchcraft is ancient, respectable, and benign, except when somebody messes with them, and then they'll defend themselves. Now, the third view, which also accepts the reality of witchcraft, argues that no, it is purely diabolical. It is an evil, malignant process. It constitutes not any kind of legitimate religious order, but rather a kind of organized malignancy within societies. That witches are bad people who do bad things. Which isn't to argue that some might use their skills to accomplish something good, but it's fundamentally something which is negative. You know, the bad, evil, the wicked witch of the West as the epitome of this thing. Even though, keep in mind, the Wizard of Oz, an important cultural artifact, does give us the good witch and the bad witch, implying that there are two different sorts in this case. Now, one of the things we're going to be talking a lot about today is we're going to be looking at two people, two scholars, in a sense, of witchcraft. One of them a woman, one of them a man. The woman will be Margaret Murry. And Margaret Murry is going to be a very important figure in the effort to establish not only the existence of witchcraft, but also the existence of witchcraft as an ancient, organized, primordial religion. And one which is on its own, if not benevolent, at least neutral. That is something that might do both good and evil, but isn't inherently, let's say, one or the other. The male protagonist in this case is Montague Summers. Now, I think that there was someone in the comments in a previous episode that wanted to know if we were going to talk about Montague Summers, so we're here. He is going to come up. Montague Summers is a very interesting guy in so many different ways, but Summers, who presented himself to the world as an ordained Catholic priest, which he probably wasn't, but nevertheless a kind of Christian cleric, was very much of the belief that witchcraft was inherently diabolical and evil. He has some interesting ideas about it being, again, the kind of corrupted form of an earlier religion, but one which had become essentially negative in everything that it did. It was bad. So Montague Summers, witches, evil and bad. Margaret Murry, witches, well, you know, they maybe had a few flaws here and there, but essentially good. Essentially just another religious custom. Now, the basic question about either one of them, as we'll see, is that either Montague Summers or Margaret Murry have any actual idea of what they were talking about, or were they just making things up? The question in so many particular areas. So let's look a little bit at the first person we mentioned. Let's look at at Margaret Murry. And Margaret Murry is, well, today she's often seen as a kind of crackpot. I mean, the first time I ever heard about her was in grad school, and I think it was a course on Tudor Stuart English history. And, that was a period when there were a lot of witch trials going on in England and Scotland. And the professor in this course blamed much of the proliferation of the interest in witchcraft on one woman, Margaret Murry, who he described as a crackpot. Well, that's kind of questionable in some ways, because Margaret Alice Murray was British. She was born in India, the British Raj, in 1863. She will live to be 100.
Okay.
Born in 1863, dies in 1963, which, by the way, some people will later view as vaguely suspicious. It's one of the things about successful witches. They tend to live a long time. They have a certain knack for that type of thing around them, arguably. So her career is interesting. She grows up in the Victorian era. She is completely a creation of the Victorian era, although she'll live long past that. During the 1890s, she studied archaeology in London. In fact, she was one of the first women to actually be sort of admitted or to penetrate the sacred precinct of Egyptology. Let me pronounce that word correct. So she was by training an Egyptologist. And in 1898, she was among the first women instructors at London's University College. Margaret Murry is an important figure in what could be termed first wave feminism. She really did sort of break through the glass ceiling or the pyramid ceiling, whatever you want to call it. She found her way, both into the study of Egyptology, into field research, and into teaching. She's been described as one of the first women to make a serious impact on the world of professional scholarship. So she may have had her psychological irregularities, but I don't think she can be fairly described as a crackpot.
Yeah.
She was a trained scholar. She was trained in the ways of research. Now, I'm not saying here that you can't be a crackpot and a trained scholar, but she was a crackpot who knew what she was doing. Let's put it that way, if she was a crackpot. She was also a member of the Women's Social and Political Union, which was the main force in Britain, which was trying to secure voting rights for British women. So she was also politically active. So during her time in this period, she was admired and respected. I don't think anybody at that time who knew her in those days would have described her as a crackpot. She's often hailed as a shining example of female activism in this period. So I'd go on the argument that my professor in that class was wrong. Margaret Murry might be many things, but she was not a crackpot. That is, she wasn't someone who had no basis for what it was that she was saying. Although, to be fair, her basic academic training was in Egyptology, and for some reason in 1921, she turns her attention towards British folklore. In fact, that's an area she'd always been interested in. And that's typical. I mean, most people, I don't know, how many things do I have interest in? I quit counting a long time ago.
Well, I understood this book, before you and I brought it up. I had heard of it before, and I always thought it was a cultural anthropology book, or it was a study in cultural anthropology, basically. An early one from the 20s.
It is, yeah.
But that's essentially what it is. So if she's doing Egyptology, it sounds germane to the same.
Well, there's a methodology which is involved in it, and part of it is you try to collect evidence and organize that evidence and then assess it against counter evidence
and reconstruct traditional religious life ways and populations.
So she was a trained academic who knew how to conduct research and to assess information. That was the main thing she had. And in 1921, she sort of put her interest in Egyptology, at least temporarily, aside. And that's the year, in 1921, in which she published the book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe. And, that came out of her parallel interest in British folklore. And so how did she go about researching that? Well, where do you go to research things about witches? Where are they discussed? In the records of the witch trials. And this, again, was something that particularly in the 16th and 17th and even into the 18th century, written records of that were kept. Remember, these were judicial proceedings, and there were charges, and there was evidence given, and people would often be questioned extensively about what they did in witches, what they did as witches or in the pursuit of witchcraft. And so she began to collect evidence basically by looking at the trials and simply looking at what people were saying and comparing that with what people said in other cases. And in essence, she found out that there was a lot of similarity in these things. So that if the assumption was that, well, again, here you had, a view might be that, again, the witches were simply women unjustly accused of doing something which at most was probably just some kind of harmless cultural practice, but they were being unjustly accused and victimized and probably tortured into confessing. Now, one of the things that Murray found is that there was little indication of the use of torture. In some cases, the confessions had to be coerced by various threats. I mean, one of the main things that was used was simply offering some witches the chance to escape death by turning state's evidence. That's what would. There's nothing new about that tactic. You basically only go after one person or a couple of people, and you'll give the others lesser charges if they'll roll over on them. So it would also, she would assume that if these were simply women under duress who were being forced to confess to something, Murray found it odd that the confessions in so many ways bore similarity to each other. These people would be asked about what sort of things did you do, who did you meet, how were things organized, what was a sabbat or a kind of witch's religious ceremony. How did that take place? And while there were lots of local variations in this, as you might expect in a kind of organization in which there was no overall authority. I mean, think of it this way. The Catholic Church could institute and enforce a common mass in every church. That is, the mass was to be carried out in exactly the same way everywhere. You had a whole hierarchy and a system which could institute this and enforce it. Even then, probably little variations would creep in. But if you think, on the other hand, of groups of people carrying out a kind of surreptitious religious practice, which would often have to take place in secrecy and lacking any kind of larger, lacking a pope of witchcraft, so to speak, or any kind of organized activity, that what you'd have is that these individual groups, the sort of parishes or covens, if you wanted to call them that, there would be a lot of local variation because there wasn't anything to enforce a regularity, a kind of uniformity among them. But still, Murray found that what these people were describing in different places, and she also went outside of the British Isles. She looked at cases in France and Germany, the Netherlands, I even think as far away as Denmark. And she found, in her mind at least, that what was being described was very much the same thing, which led her to the scholarly conclusion that these were not just kind of random inventions, that there was something going on here. There seemed to be some kind of organized practice. So that's where she developed the idea of the witch cult. So based upon the evidence that she believed that she had found, mostly in the accounts of the witch trials, because a lot of witches at this time didn't write memoirs. That wasn't really going to happen. So the question might be, where else were you going to find any other kind of information except when accused witches had been compelled to talk about their activities? So Murray, ever the sort of scholar in this case, decided, putting the evidence together, that what this suggested to her was that there was, if not a religion organized in the sense of something like the Catholic Church, that there was nevertheless a kind of organized or semi-organized traditional practice. There was this kind of counter-religion which existed primarily in rural areas, in the countryside, often in areas far away from the direct view of religious and, of the formal church or of the king's authorities. And that it was inevitably, because it was illegal, because it would be immediately destroyed if it reared its head, had learned various methods to exist under the radar. For instance, organizing your meetings in the woods at night. Maybe you don't have a church to go to. You don't have a building. You simply probably have a traditional place where you would meet and carry out your ceremonies. And then everyone would disperse. And the next morning there's, just some candle wax and a few stub torches lying around. And everybody else can't quite figure out what's going on. But she believed that this was at least a real religion in the sense, or at least a religious cult that existed throughout much of Western Europe. She didn't really try to connect this to anything else. But she could see the similarities and believed that this was the continuation of something that she dubbed the Dianic religion. And that's often assumed, I've seen people read this, that, what she was talking about was Diana, the Greco-Roman goddess of the hunt, goddess of the night and the moon, often connected with magic in different traditions. But that wasn't she wasn't talking about Diana. No, Murray's Dianic religion referred to the god Dionysus, who is, depending upon the particular view and tradition, either the brother, the son, or the consort of Diana. So in some branches of modern Wicca, he's actually viewed as all three. He is Diana's son, he is Diana's brother, and he's Diana's boyfriend. And he is the god and the goddess. This kind of holy duo is often used in modern witchcraft, but he takes the kind of backseat. Diana is in the front. The goddess, in a matriarchal system, she of course is in charge, and he's there as the consort. Sort of the witchcraft's equivalent to Prince Philip to Queen Elizabeth's Diana. But it's not clear, certainly if you look in Margaret Murray's reconstruction of the cult. She called it the Dianic cult after Dionysus because the evidence she collected, it appeared that the horned god, not the goddess, was the primary focus of worship. And this is one of the things that is interesting, a kind of contrast between more modern, say, forms of witchcraft and those that existed in the ones in prior centuries, is that there the male role in this, and even to some degree, dare I say, male supremacy. And I'm not, arguing. I'm just saying that's the way it was. Okay, if you go back, and the basis of that was that the reason why Dionysus, or let's give him his actual name in this case, or a more current name, Pan. Dionysus is basically Pan. He is the god of nature. He is the god of increase in fertility. He's got goat feet and hairy legs and horns. That's Pan. The Romans would simply use the term Dionysus, sometimes, it's a funny thing about deities. They can just sort of take any kind of name. What you always have to look for is their form. Mm-hmm. Their form usually doesn't change. Name is, well, what's in a name in this case? So one of the interesting things that you can do going through Margaret's work is to sort of look at the description of what a typical, so a religious ceremony or meeting in this witch cult, as conceived of by Murray or reconstructed by Murray or imagined by her or made up, whichever version you want to take, is the Sabbat. That's when the people would assemble, and those were on a fairly regular basis. They were almost always at night. They were often centered around the Sabbats, were usually focused around, they don't really know in this case. I mean, for instance, in Christian churches, you would get together every Sunday. It was a weekly thing. So did the Dianic religion have weekly meetings, or did they only meet at particular times of the year? Maybe we'll come back to them describing what those would be. But what you would do is you get an assembly of people, often some secluded area in the woodlands someplace, so when they were unlikely to be disturbed by anyone else. Descriptions of these meetings would often describe people from different social classes who were there. That is, while the majority of people often came from the peasantry, and that does seem to be one thing which is fairly consistent. Most practitioners of witchcraft, the idea of it itself, of arguably of this witch cult, tended to be fairly lower class. It tended to be focused among the peasantry, and which isn't too surprising because remember, most people at this time were peasants. Yeah. So if you say that most witches were peasants, well, most people in anything were peasants. But you mostly found in the countryside as opposed to the towns. But there would often be townspeople there. So you came across descriptions of where, well, in the course of the Sabbat, the assembled parishioners, let's call them, would have to acknowledge their God. So while all of this is going on, somewhere seated on a rock or on some kind of platform is a person dressed in a costume. Now this is, we could argue, well, no, it was actually the devil. Well, it could have been, but since he can only be in so many places at one time or another, the general agreement, one of the things that, for instance, Montague Summers and Margaret Murry agree on is that the so-called head of the Sabbat, the devil, the person in the goat man costume, so to speak, was always a person in a costume. Think of them as religious vestments. All right, think of a Catholic priest. He dresses up in a costume. Does he wear those things all the time? No, there is a particular vestments. There's a particular clothing of symbolic importance which is worn in order to carry out religious rites. And the idea was that the imitation of Pan or Dionysus as a focus of worship was also accomplished through the use of a mask, maybe fake wooden feet, furry pants, something that would look usually a figure in black, usually looking goat-like, but again, there was always a kind of animalistic appearance. That is, Dionysus or Pan always appeared in some kind of animal form. And that's who was being given that was who was in the position of authority at the meeting. So, people from the lowest classes, the peasantry, would often kneel in front of him, whereas someone who was better dressed would only curtsy or bow. So that meant that class distinctions were even observed at the Sabbat in this case. So what do people do there? Well, they honored their god or a symbol of their god. And there's a lot of sirens going on in the background.
I don't know if you can pick those up.
Anyway, if you hear that, that's just, I don't know, something's going on somewhere, which is probably not a witch's Sabbath. But again, if you were going to compare this to a Catholic Mass or elsewhere, that, God is represented by things there, either represented by the cross, represented through the priest, but you can't really see them. There are images that are around this, but there are these representations of deity, and that this person dressed up in the goat costume was a representation of Pan. So part of the ritual would involve the introduction of new members. So someone might bring their son or daughter to be baptized, to go through a religious initiation. And the most common one of those in a Christian context is baptism. What do you do to join the religious community? You are, unless you're an Anabaptist, I guess, you are baptized, whether as an infant or as an adult. There is a ritual, a ceremony which is involved. And in many cases, in a witch's Sabbath, you would get something similar to this. The candidate would be brought forward. They would bow. They would present themselves to what was called the devil. This was often the term which was used in England for this figure. He was the devil. Not necessarily Satan, but the devil as the head of the Sabbath. Some also sometimes referred to as the man in black, or Lord, or Master, or simply as God. And the chosen would be brought forward, and there was usually a lot of kissing that went on. Right? So she would probably kiss his hands, his feet, his buttocks, his sexual organs, whatever it was that he tended. Now, one of the things about this is that, as opposed to, let's say, a Christian Mass, these Dianic ceremonies tended to be rather earthy, because after all, this is a nature god of fertility, which you have here. Whatever part of his body presented would be kissed. In some cases, those kisses would be returned. There might be an exchange of blood, that is, cutting wrists or fingers and joining the blood together. There were different variations on this, but there was almost always a lot of kissing, and there would often be a kind of seal that would be placed upon the member. I remember one of the things that often in witch trials they were always looking for were spots or this type of thing. What it appears that they were actually looking for was some kind of tattoo, some sort of mark. Because there would need to be a way, an often inconspicuous means, by which members of this religion could recognize each other. So something that might look like a mole or a birthmark, often in an obscure area that wouldn't attract a lot of attention. And you wouldn't want to tattoo "I love Satan" on your neck, because that would be kind of a giveaway. Or, Pan, that's my man. Okay. That would be a little too bold, but just a kind of subtle mark somewhere, maybe on the inside of a wrist or thigh, or whatever you wanted it, on your butt. That would be a way of identification. That's why witch hunters were so interested in inspecting people's bodies in order to find these particular marks, which are almost never natural, but which have been placed there. And so after the new initiations, after all of the kissing was done, there's also an oath that was supposedly given here. "O Master, I put myself wholeheartedly in your power and in your hands. I recognize no other God. You alone are my God."
It's pretty straightforward.
This is a straightforward oath of allegiance to Dionysus or to Pan. Notice that in these versions, it's not a goddess that they are swearing.
So does she say this is Pan, or does she didn't go that far?
I don't remember if she did. I think, that Pan would fit into this model. Again, you're dealing with a kind of image which look at the form as opposed to the name. Faunus, Pan, sometimes even Bacchus was presented in much the same way. But, Pan is probably the oldest term. That's which goes back to.
Does she give a lineage for, because is Pan Greek?
Greek.
So, I mean, all throughout Western Europe, they have their own weird things. But I just am curious about if this is what she's looking at.
Well, there's a Celtic deity called Cernunnos, which also is pictured with horns. So that's one of the main things you want to look for. Does he have horns?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was kind of wondering if there was this overlay of this is all kind of folk pagan stuff that gets kind of, it continues. So, and
there are local variations. There are different names which are involved. It's more in the visual representation that we'll find. Pan is I may say more about him, is an unusual Greek deity in that he doesn't really fit in with the Olympians. He's just there.
He's just fat.
Pan has always been there. Pan is the personification, is the consciousness of nature. That's one way to use that. Pan is really, if you think of nature as being alive, well, that's what he is. Okay. If you believe in that sort of thing. So, Master, I put myself wholeheartedly in your power, and in your hands I recognize no other God. You alone are my God. In doing that, you have rejected the Christian church, you have rejected the Christian God, or whatever the prevailing religious traditions might have been. And this is one of the things that Murray sort of recognized in this, is that these people had often a very fierce loyalty to this faith. Remember, this was something they clung to. It was dangerous to do these things. If you were caught out worshiping Pan in the woods at night, you could indeed be killed as a result of this. So it was something that had to be hidden. It was something that was essentially viewed as, in the larger society, as a criminal, even diabolical activity. You had to hide what you were doing. It was not something in the light of day that you could ever reveal, which goes on to argue that it also created a somewhat strange attitude towards mainstream society in general. Remember, you had to continue on a day-to-day basis to live within a society and within a religious order which you rejected personally, which you were not part of. You would have to pretend to be a Christian when in fact you had sworn loyalty to another god. Then the business of the Sabbath then turned around to recounting. The members there would have to recount what they had done in service of their God, or in service in what sort of magical things have you done, or what sort of personal things have you done? How have you shown your loyalty to me? So he would then, on the basis of that, he being the man in black, the image of Dionysus or Pan, would dispense praise, advice, or he would chastise accordingly. You've done well, my child. You haven't done well. You need to do better. The saying was that his powers are not granted to go unused. So here it comes into the idea that Pan, the god, would dispense or grant certain powers to those who were faithful to him. And you were supposed to do things with those powers. And what could those powers include? Well, they could include things like the evil eye, to harm or to heal through intention. You could rot silk, you could curdle milk, you could kill livestock, you could do things like go into a church and do something disgusting with a crucifix, or contaminate the wafers that were used in the Mass. The emphasis, and maybe this again was what most of the witch hunters or those persecuting, their whole effort was to prove that there had been some kind of socially unacceptable actions that were taking place. And so the idea was that the adherents of this hidden church would then carry out hidden attacks against their adversary. Now, this, by the way, is something that Montague Summers will begin to emphasize, is what he argues was the wholeheartedly negative aspect of this. That over time, that this cult, which he also agrees existed, simply became to focus upon doing bad stuff. I mean, to them, it was an act of devotion to their god, but in the larger society, it was essentially just kind of malicious vandalism that would take place. So, the god granted you powers to do things, and you were to use those magical powers in his service, to attack his enemies, and also to do things, for your own kind of benefit, but almost always at the idea of attacking or undermining, subverting the existing Christian order. And if you hadn't done that, well, then you would be in trouble. Once the ceremonies the ceremony would build up once everything had sort of gone through and there'd been this sort of accounting as to who had done this and who had done that. There might be a sacrifice. Very often that was a young he-goat. That is a kind of small substitute for the god himself. And here again, there is this interesting connection, and I can't remember whether Murray points this out. Summers certainly did, being Christian cleric, between, if you think of it, the Christian Mass. Well, what does the Mass actually enact? What happens in this case? Well, it is a magical transformation, and it is magical. Okay, the Church calls it a mystery. I mean, keep in mind, this is the most fundamental rite in Catholicism, but when you ask them, what does it mean? How does it work? It's a mystery. We don't know, or we're not going to tell you. But what does the priest, the prevailing magician, all right, so keep this in mind, a priest, an ordained priest, is a kind of magician. He has powers which have been given to him by his God. And those powers allow him in the Mass, through the recitation of a particular formalized incantation, through the performance, through the ceremony, what happens? He transforms the wine into the blood of Christ, the blood of the living God, and he transforms the wafer into the flesh of Christ, the living God. Christ, of course, is sacrificed. His death on the cross is a sacrifice to redeem humanity from sin. The Mass is a kind of constant reenactment of the sacrifice. I'm not sure how many Catholic theologians would go along with it, but one argument is that you kill your God over and over and over again. This is a ritual sacrifice of Christ, and then you partake of his flesh and blood, which has weird connotations of cannibalism, but I don't know. It's theophagism. There is a word for this, God eating, which takes place. So not too surprisingly, it's some could argue, and some definitely have argued, Montague Summers, is that the witchcraft ceremonies, the witchcraft Sabbath is its own sort of sacrificial ritual. It's a kind of debasement or reversal of the Christian ritual. But again, when you look at them closely, there are these similarities between them. But once you'd gotten through all the kind of administrative stuff and you'd sacrificed the goat and collected its blood, and then maybe what would everyone do when you collect the blood of the sacrificed goat? They would drink it. They might even roast it and eat its flesh. See, the goat now becomes the scapegoat, becomes your God. He is killed and sacrificed, and everyone partakes of his flesh and blood. Then things got down to what everybody probably showed up there for, the dancing and fornication. Okay. The orgy, which everyone assumes, because, what's going to be a witch's Sabbath without an orgy? It's not clear that those always occur, but usually that was what was expected around in the woods. People would throw off their clothes, but this again was a religious action. It was a sacrament to take part of this in front of the god of fornication, the god of nature and of increase. So it was a kind of religious sex, which was
sex magic,
then partaking in.
Sort of.
And then once that was over, everybody put their clothes back on and usually said, "Merry met, merry part." So always pay attention if you hear anybody say that. Merry met, merry part, and then everybody took their candles and disappeared in the woods and went back to their normal lives. The next day, nobody else around them, their neighbors, knew what was going on. A little bit more about Pan as a deity is that it's probably among the oldest and most mysterious of the Greek deities. He's simply the Lord of nature, and as the Lord of nature, he rules increase, fertility. And one of the things about Pan is that where we get our word panic from, uncontrollable fear, is that Pan could induce that in people. You know, typically you're out in the woods and you hear some sort of strange noise. Well, today people will tell you it was Bigfoot, but in ancient Greece, they would just tell you it was Pan trying to scare you. Which brings up the interesting idea, is Bigfoot just Pan making himself look large and just doing his old thing of scaring people? That's a silly idea. Or not. But also he could offer you protection from fear. In other words, the God that can induce fear can protect you from that. So if you're out in the deep, dark, spooky woods, which keep in mind, if you look at particularly Western European folk tales, the woods are always kind of a scary place. Well, they are. They're deep and dark and things lurk there. And so it's not too surprising that you could become overcome with fear. So Pan could both be the terror in the woods, but he could also be the protection from that terror, because if Pan was with you, you had nothing to fear. And also, as the god of terror, he was the god of ecstasy. This is what part of that whole sort of dancing and fornication was about. Because Pan, as the god of nature, the god of the physical world and its mechanism of increase, which was sex, that's why it was a holy thing to them, was also the god of ecstasy, of all the pleasures of the world. So this Dianic religion was not based upon the concept of some glorious afterlife. You did not suffer here in order to sit at the throne of God and stare at him in ecstasy for eternity, but you enjoyed yourself among the bounty that Pan offered here. Dance and song were sacred to him. In return, however, Pan demanded veneration and he demanded sacrifice. You always had to prove your loyalty. It's the rule of nature. And nature is very simple. Nature provides bounty, but it also, what nature giveth, nature taketh away. You don't get something for nothing. There is always some cost which is extracted. Life must be nourished by death. That's a very simple rule of nature, which even you vegans out there will have to accept, is that the way you maintain your life is by consuming the life of other living things. Whether that's plants or animals, to Pan would make no difference. Life is nourished by death. In order to survive, you must kill and consume other living things. And then when you die, all those plants you ate will eat you. That's just the dance of nature in this case. So the idea here is that this wasn't cruel and it wasn't evil. It was simply the law. It was simply Pan's law of nature. Now, that arguably imbued this so-called witch cult with a different moral code, a very different one than in Christianity's. In place of forgiveness, the cult supposedly embraced vengeance as a primary virtue. Now, this didn't mean you didn't go out and try to deliberately harm people unless they presented some kind of harm to you. So, it says, as long as you sort of keep your distance and leave me alone, we have no problem.
Yeah.
But if you do mess with me, then I have in my religion every absolute reason and justification to act even proactively against you. So mess with me at your peril, which again is appealing to people, particularly people in lower classes who often felt powerless otherwise. I mean, you can see how, in a way, the idea that if your God was going to give you power, if he was going to give you magical power, if he was going to give you the power to heal or kill, you, who might otherwise be an illiterate peasant, now had kind of achieved a certain, if not actually equalized your position. You had a power that the other more openly powerful people around you didn't have. And that was a way of sort of managing your environment. Whether it was real or not, it was one of those things that would be appealing to someone who was otherwise powerless. So in place of forgiveness, there was vengeance. Instead of the rewards of the next world, there were the joys of this one, to live deliciously on the fruits of the earth. Now, that led Margaret Murry to proclaim that despite its occasional acceptance of vengeance and murder, which were all part of nature as well, it was a joyous religion. It was a happy religion, which generally focused upon those issues that exulted in life, even though she acknowledged it did engage, at least occasionally, in human sacrifice as well as animal sacrifice. Now, that simply comes down to the idea of which shows greater devotion. Now, imagine, for instance, that you're in the position of a god, okay, that you are Pan, and someone brings before you a goat or a chicken, which they just bought 15 minutes ago at a market, and they're going to sacrifice this to you. Well, they have no vested interest in this chicken. They don't even know its name. Okay, this is just some sort of animal which they purchased and which they're now offering to you. And what they're basically offering to you is the cost of its purchase, which, let's face it, in the case of a chicken, isn't very much. Would you regard that as a terribly important or serious sacrifice?
Wasn't that the whole, in the market when Christ is flipping over tables and stuff, people selling animals and other things for sacrifice and stuff like that? Not say that's exactly the same. Sacrificing your son when God asks, who was it? Who was that? I'm blanking on my religion, on my Christian history.
Isaac.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. And the whole idea behind that is because it's a significant thing, right? So,
well, you cut to the point there. On the other hand, if you offer your firstborn child.
Oh, no.
Okay. If you offer your son, well, you can call that murder, which it certainly would be. But, well, now there's an interesting religious question there. In the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac, Abraham certainly assumed that Yahweh was serious about this. And, it's like in the Bob Dylan song, God said to Abraham, kill me a son. Abraham said, where do you want this killing done? And also, if you don't do it, the next time you see me, you better run. So that was, but the whole point was even though Abraham does not, in the end, is given a pass on the sacrifice, what he has to demonstrate to Yahweh is that he will do it.
Yeah.
That there is no, that was the kind of test of loyalty which was demanded of him. And nonetheless suggesting that human sacrifice was not such a unknown quantity in there. It was one of the, but that would demonstrate seriousness of purpose. And then that would give the sacrifice her the ability to come back and say, and ask their God for a real favor, because I have done this for you. So what will you then do for me? What I get from you, this would be Pan's or any god's sort of idea. The seriousness with which the sacrifice is committed is the seriousness of which you will be rewarded.
And the transactional nature of pre-Abrahamic religions was that's a universal thing, right? And pretty much all world religions. So
make a deal.
I'm curious about, does she draw that comparison to say that this might be some pre-existing religion or cult, or is this endemic specifically to this? Like, did they just come up with this kind of as I recall, which, this is she thinks this goes back. This isn't something that developed as a counter to Christianity. Okay, that's what I was.
So the Dianic religion wasn't something that came along, that people who thought that Christianity wasn't much fun and didn't let them, fornicate in the fields, so they would form their own religion. No, that had been around long before.
Okay.
And it was Christianity which had then assumed the dominant position and pushed this other religion out into the woods at night. It sort of marginalized it, but had never really replaced it.
Yeah.
And I think she also has this idea that that the Dianic religion was more than just these kind of sporadic local meetings. It was something more than a religion that was just sort of barely hanging on, that was increasing, which is more the way in which Montague Summers viewed it, is that it was really, Summers' view was that witchcraft, I'll try to elaborate a bit on further to get further on, but that witchcraft was the degenerate remnants of some former pagan religion.
Okay.
But it barely even passed as a kind of religion anymore, but instead it just become this set of ritualized, largely negative activities. Whereas Murray's idea was that the Dianic religion really was this kind of joyous nature religion, which had been around for centuries or millennia. Maybe it was the original sort of religion, which went back long before Christianity was ever around. And which was really, in many ways, just the kind of natural religion of common agricultural people. In the context of a peasant's life, this all seemed to make much sense, because what are they concerned with? Well, the growing of plants and animals, everything around them. If you don't have the god of fertility on your side as a farmer, you're in a lot of trouble, and therefore sacrifices will be necessary in order to keep this whole process going. She does acknowledge the sort of acceptance of ritualized violence as a part of it. And even again, the concept of vengeance as a kind of sacrament. That doesn't mean that witches couldn't forgive, but it wasn't, but there was nothing wrong with taking revenge. That was your sort of right to do so. That balanced things out in that respect. So the question then comes back: how much of this stuff did Margaret Murry actually distill from her study of witch trial documentation, and how much did she make up? Well, that's always the question. I mean, did she... One of the arguments was that she really had this, she developed this whole idea of some kind of witch cult to begin with, and then went through the records looking for things that would support that. And she would find things that allowed her to sort of construct something that maybe really wasn't there. Or that this was all something that she realized, she collected the information, she analyzed it, and this was the picture that emerged. So was it that, or did she already have the picture in her head and then she found the information that helped her to flesh that out? I don't know. Neither does anybody else except Margaret Murry, and she's dead. Or maybe even she wasn't sure in this case. But there is, of course, another interesting and intriguing possibility, is that Margaret Murry herself was a witch, and that what she was doing in her book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, was advertising this. Because on the whole, she does present it fairly positively. She sees it as essentially a fairly, if not a benign thing, at least something which is no better or worse than other religions around. So what could possibly, well, there were some people who noted that, yes, she did live a very long time, but also that she was, as some of her associates noted, even very late in life in the 1940s and 1950s. Remember, she's going to be 100 in 1963 when she passes on to Pan's bosom, or whoever it was that she went. She was something of a practitioner of witchcraft. She would sometimes jokingly claim to have put curses on people, some of whom actually had bad things happen to them. In other words, there were associates of her in academia and elsewhere during her lifetime who believed that she had more than an academic interest in witchcraft, and that in promoting the concept of a Dianic religion, she was either writing about something that she was actually part of or something which she was seeking to create in some way. So that then kind of leads us to her partner, sort of opposite. I don't want to use the word antagonist. That's Montague Summers. And Montague Summers is a interesting character in that he's British. He's the son of a banker, born again in Victorian England. I think he's born about 1880. He's about 5 years younger, I think, than Aleister Crowley. Now, of course, everybody knows who Aleister Crowley is, right? The most preeminent occultist of the 20th century. Not a witch in that case. I mean, Crowley's name, maybe again we'll say more about this, is often connected with witchcraft. I can't find that Crowley ever would describe himself that way or involve. Crowley would almost certainly have viewed witchcraft as too low class. He was a magus. He was a magician. He was a practitioner of high ritual magic. He wasn't someone, and true, on occasion he would crucify a toad. But again, that was for some type of, there actually was a reason to do that. But Crowley was not, I think it's probably, without saying it certainly, inaccurate to portray him as the kind of father of modern witchcraft, because it wasn't something he would probably deign even to bother himself with, even if he recognized that it was a form of the practice of magic, but not a form sophisticated or powerful enough as he would see it for him to bother with.
Yeah.
It was the type of thing that peasants did out in the woods at night. Now, Montague Summers showed an early interest in religion and went into the priesthood. He first went into the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And I think around in 1908, he was ordained a deacon in the Church of England, which is just one step from becoming a priest. I don't know, assistant priest, maybe that was the way it would be. But you haven't gotten all the magical powers yet. You haven't graduated from Hogwarts. But then his career took a change when he was pretty much defrocked and kicked out of the Church of England for attempting indecent liberties with a choir boy. And this is one of the things to keep in mind, neither good nor bad, about Montague Summers, is that he was most certainly and most determinedly gay from an early age, and a pederast. Generally, younger men and boys were what he was most interested in. How surprising. Okay. I mean, it's almost a trope. A priest with an interest in choir boy. Okay. That trope has been around, and he lived up to that. So he got kicked out of the Church of England, and he then converted to Roman Catholicism and would later claim that he had been ordained a Catholic priest. And he would, for the rest of his life, publicly and privately celebrate the Catholic Mass, which you're not supposed to do if you aren't actually a priest. And the answer to this riddle is that what no one can find is any record of him having been ordained in the regular Catholic Church. And there should be. That would have taken place. Yeah. There would be, remember, Catholic Church was a big institution, had all kinds of people who did nothing but keep records of things. Can't find that anywhere. The answer to that seems to be that Summers was ordained as a priest by a wandering bishop, by an episcopi vagante. What's a wandering bishop?
We talked about it a little bit.
We've talked about them a little bit. We may go into them again. The wandering bishops basically goes like this. Permit me a little sidebar here. The episcopi vagantes, or wandering bishops, are legitimate Christian bishops who are not really connected to any mainstream or established church. Now, by tradition, a bishop can consecrate another person as a bishop. I should say bishops consecrate, priests are ordained. And that's by the laying out of hands. And so, this goes back to the early creation of Christianity itself, is that a bishop would consecrate another person as a bishop. Now, as the traditions within the church developed, eventually, ideally, you were supposed to have two other bishops there to witness what was going on. So it wasn't just bishops running around willy-nilly consecrating people as other bishops. And even in some cases to insist that there had to be three bishops present, even in some cases that all three of them had to participate in the consecration. But that's just an elaboration of the system. If a bishop who was legitimately consecrated on his own consecrated someone else, even the Church of Rome could not argue that was an irregular consecration, but they couldn't say that the person who was consecrated was not a bishop because they had been, it's an act of magical transference. The bishop had spiritual powers, i.e. magical powers, and those included his ability to pass that authority on to someone else through touch, through the laying on of hands. So the idea was that the church, whether it's the Catholic or the Eastern Orthodox or anybody, you want to keep the ordination of priests and consecration of bishops under some sort of controlled system, so you know who's doing what. But there were, and there apparently always had been, bishops who just went around consecrating other bishops willy-nilly, without any of the other kind of higher authority. And those people who then had no formal connection with the church were not employed by the church, still had these powers, but they became the wandering bishops. And there's a whole subculture of this that exists right up to today. There are all of these kind of lines of succession. There was some guy who started consecrating bishops, and those went on to consecrate other bishops, and sometimes they consecrated each other. You get this type of thing that one person, Bishop A, will create Bishop B, And then Bishop B will in some time return the favor of going back and reconsecrating Bishop A. Those are the sort of trade because this reinforces the magic.
Okay.
The more bishops you are consecrated by somehow increases that, and also the legitimacy that it wasn't just this one guy who did it willy-nilly, but see, 4 other bishops.
People are weird.
Well, people are weird. That would make a great title for a book, which you should think about writing. My favorite book was just writing a whole history book, because what the hell is the matter with people? Because I think that's really what we want to know. And what does history teach us about that?
That's really
what does it teach us? They're all insane.
Yes.
So it's just more human insanity, I suppose, that takes place. But that's what, and Summers was connected with wandering bishops, and it's one of those who ordained him, didn't make him a bishop, so far as I know. He might have been, who made him a priest. So was he ever told by the church he could perform in the mass? But nonetheless, he got away with it. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is you don't find many Catholic officials making a big deal out of that, maybe because they never wanted to look too closely into that. He usually did perform the mass in private, but there may be another purpose in that as well. So in 1908, because of his attempts to seduce a choir boy, he was kicked out of the Anglican Church, went over to Roman Catholic. Are they more tolerant of that? I don't know. Well, look into recent scandals within the church and you tell me. But there was also another thing that worried some people in the Anglican Church. He had also taken a particular interest in evil and Satanism.
What do you mean, particular interest?
He studied it.
Okay.
He talked about it a lot. In fact, he seems to have talked about it incessantly. He tried to collect all of the different books. One of the things that influenced in this is that he had read a book from the 1890s, a relatively recent book, by the writer Joris Huysmans, called Là-bas. I've mentioned this before. Là-bas, or below, or down there, is about a number of things, but it's essentially about, in late 19th century Paris, the centerpiece of the whole thing was based upon Huysmans' attendance of a black mass, which he describes in vivid detail. And it's worth noting that the person who is performing this mass is an ordained Catholic priest, a priest who has long since left the bosom of the church, but is still an ordained priest who is now performing a perverted or inverted mass in the honor of Satan as opposed to Christ. A priest who has little pictures of Jesus tattooed on the bottoms of his feet so that he is stepping on the face of Christ constantly. That's, what often seems to be it seems kind of petty, but nevertheless, this is, hold on there. Hold on to that thought. And Huysmans, the description of the Black Mass in Là-bas is really kind of disquieting because it's just nasty. I mean, there's nothing really particularly joyous about it. I mean, people seem to be kind of some sort of weird sexual charge to the whole thing, but it comes across as quite debased. But that's what one argument got Summers kind of interested in this type of thing. And so what disturbed some of his Church of England superiors, that this was a prospect for the priesthood, a man whose next step was to be ordained a priest, who showed a peculiar interest in Satanism. And someone else, a sort of friend of Summers that went around this same period, noticed that they actually visited him once and he appeared to be in a state of great agitation. And the whole thing was that he was obsessed with evil. That was the only thing that they could describe, is that he'd sort of become obsessed with this idea of evil. So there appears to have been some kind of religious transformation or transmutation that took place in Summers' case. And then he goes on to be ordained a priest outside the regular framework of the Catholic Church, but to still on his own perform the Mass. And the other thing, now it should be said about Montague Summers, is that he was, again, like Margaret Murry, of a scholarly inclination. He wrote poetry, who didn't? But he also became quite an acknowledged expert in Restoration drama. A sort of English theater, the Restoration era. And he wrote extensively about that. He was involved in restaging productions, and his work in that was greatly admired. He was an expert, a scholarly expert in Restoration drama. Make of that what you will. The point being is that, like Margaret Murry, just as Margaret Murry didn't devote her whole life to the study of the witch cult, but was really started as an Egyptologist, Montague Summers was a literary scholar, let's call him that, who then became increasingly interested in the occult, or in particular the more negative aspects of that. What did he go on to write? Beginning in the 1920s, what did he start writing books about? Witchcraft, demonology, werewolves, and vampires. He wrote books on all of those. The vampire, his kith and kin, the werewolf, one of the books that I have up here, The History of Witchcraft and Demonology, which, yes, I have taken and read in airports. And yes, it will keep people from sitting next to you. Try it on a plane sometime and see what reaction you get. So that became, part of it was that got a lot, what is going to sell more, do you think? A book on Restoration drama or a book on werewolves, especially a book on werewolves in which Summers purports not just to be writing about werewolves, like, oh, this werewolf stuff is weird, let's write about it. No, he's writing by going, they're real.
Yeah.
Lycanthropy is a real thing. Werewolves actually exist. They're probably creeping around your town right now, and this is how you look out for vampires. Real. There actually are vampires, and they're a lot more disgusting than Dracula's sexy vampire. No, they're not like that. They're evil and disgusting. So, needless to say, did Montague Summers believe that witches were real? Yep, just as much as Margaret Murry. Witchcraft was absolutely real to him, and he would agree with Murray. It was an organized kind of underground religion. And thus the devil was real, Satanism was real, all of these things that he had taken an interest in. So you can sort of imagine how his early interest in Satanism and black masses and evil would then later translate into him writing books about witches, werewolves, and vampires. Now, a little earlier I had mentioned Aleister Crowley, which again was the wickedest man in the world in the opinion of the British press, a fellow constantly identified more or less unjustly with black magic. Remember, Crowley always argued that, no, I'm a good magician. He's like Gilda. I'm a good witch. That Crowley and Montague Summers knew each other pretty well. They met socially, lived during the same sort of, Crowley dies in 1947. Montague Summers dies in 1948. Their lives almost completely overlap with each other. There's even the similarity that Crowley, of course, mostly saw himself as the prophet and founder of a new religion. He wanted to come up with the new religion of Thelema, however you want it. I'm going to say Thelema. And that, not Thelma, as the FBI thought it was, the Church of Thelma. And they kept trying to figure out who Thelma was. But, so that even Crowley sees himself as essentially a kind of religious leader, almost literally in a kind of priest-like role, and Montague Summers just does that through more existing institutions, first through the Anglican, then through the Catholic, but neither completely with one or the other. And They also both have a background in nonconformist British Christianity. Both of them were raised in sort of certainly in Christian households that were not mainstream in their practice. They met, and during the course of the 1930s, would meet at social occasions, and were all to appearances got along quite well. I mean, they had a lot of things to talk about. All right, so if Montague Summers was nothing more than a religious scholar interested in Satanism and the devil, you know, we got a chance to sit down at a table and talk to supposedly the most outstanding British Satanist of the era, whether he was or not, you'd probably do that. But they seem to have gotten along reasonably well. There's a little sidelight to that. Montague Summers was spying on Crowley. He had an entire dossier on him. And who was he spying on him for? Who did he send his reports to on Crowley? To Father Joseph Ledit in the Vatican. Okay. Ledit was sort of it was a Jesuit in the head of, I don't know, maybe you could describe him as sort of the Vatican's X-Files, but Ledit was very interested in Crowley, who he thought was some sort of minion of the devil. And Summers supplied him with that information, which Crowley may or may not have been aware of. One of the interesting details is that after Crowley died in 1947, Montague Summers dies in 1948. According to Summers' secretary, soon after his death, two men who claimed to be from the British government arrived at his house and came in and took away a number of his personal papers and disappeared with them. They took something from him, which may suggest, you know, my obsession with spies, that, well, if Montague Summers was spying on Crowley for the Vatican, what other type of intelligence work could he have been involved in? Who else was he spying on, and who did he supply that information to? So, but the darker suspicion about Montague Summers, which maybe his friendship with Crowley merely hints at, is that Montague Summers was a Satanist.
Speculation? Or is this...
Of course it's speculation.
Okay.
He wasn't going to say so. That would defeat the whole purpose. Now, why might someone think that? Well, it comes into this whole thing about what makes a black mass that is the satanic version of the Catholic mass. And there's a lot in this. We're sort of veering away from witchcraft, but these things come together. A lot of what passes for modern Satanism is, and Satanists may not like to hear this, is that it's just a knockoff of Catholicism. I mean, if you didn't have that to imitate, what would you be doing? Why is the whole centerpiece of this just the perversion of the Catholic Mass? You don't even have a ceremony of your own. You're just, you're just taking it. And that's one of the things that Summers is sort of getting to in some of his writing when he's talking about witchcraft, when he's talking about really just being no longer actually a religion in a sense, but just a kind of the negative, the kind of sticky, poisonous residue of what had been one. And that I think that is speculation that has some merit, because there are a lot of things about Montague Summers that make me suspicious. But one of the things about a black mass in a satanic context is that what makes it powerful, what gives it efficacy, is that it is performed by an actual priest. A priest who has abandoned his faith, but not abandoned his, once that power has been given to him. Remember, this is a magical consecration. Once the priest has been ordained, and especially if he has not been disavowed and ritually cast out of the church, if they never find out about this, he's out there and he's gone rogue, and he's now in the service of the other side. And in that sense, nothing carries more satanic power than a Catholic Mass performed and corrupted by an actual priest. And that's what Montague Summers was. So why is he always going around performing masses? Now, he performs the regular Mass, but if you perform the regular Mass, you can turn that into a black Mass. And it comes into the same sort of question when we raised about Margaret Murry. Did she write The Witch Cult in Western Europe as a kind of scholarly examination or as a recruiting tool? Because you know, if you write, even if you made it up, if she made the whole thing up, and you argue that no, there's this whole Dianic religion and it's really ancient and it has all, and it's all about pleasure and, occasional killing a baby, but that's just all part of the natural process of this, that, you know that there are going to be people who read that and go, where do I sign up? That really sounds cool. Remember, there's almost nothing you could invent that some human being somewhere wouldn't think was the coolest thing to do ever. Look at TikTok. By God, what is that? It's just people mindlessly imitating things that they've seen before. So write a book, give a name to it, proclaim it as an ancient religion, and you'll have people lined up around the block or creating that for themselves. Even if it didn't exist, you're creating it. Remember, the whole basis of magic, is to manifest into reality what you imagine. This goes back to an old saying that a witch always speaks of something she wishes to happen as if it has already happened.
I saw some New Age things saying exactly that.
Yes, interestingly enough. Okay. Witchcraft creeps into all kinds of things. I mean, remember, a lot of stuff that passes for New Age is, in some way or another, carries on these kind of what could roughly be called, witchcraft just basically means stuff that witches do. Yeah. Isn't it? Yeah. That's all it is. It doesn't prescribe anything which is a precise doctrine. It's simply the things that they do, the methodology. And one of those is to project, is to imagine what you wish to be, and then through will and repetition, through a kind of mental exercise, to bring that into being, to manifest that reality. Mm-hmm. So one could argue that Margaret Murry, in writing a book about a cult which did exist, is trying to bring that into the mass consciousness, because now you can get away with it. See, in 1921, you could write a book about this cult. She couldn't have done that in 1621. No, she couldn't have done it in 1721. But she could. And she could disguise it under a scholarly... This isn't to say this is what she did. Remember, I'm not insisting on anything. We're just considering the possibilities. That this would be... But even if she was making it up, this was now a way of manifesting. There's no real Dianic witchcraft cult. Well, there is now, because I just wrote a book about it, and I said there was. And in the same way, if you look at what Montague Summers does, he writes these really sort of popularized, slightly sexed up books about witchcraft and vampires and werewolves. He attracts attention to these things. He actually creates the idea that these things exist. I mean, Montague Summers himself was a character. I mean, aside from everything else, he dressed like a... Best description of him is that he affected a dress and appearance like a Catholic priest from the era of Louis XIV. So he wore a cassock. He had he had Princess Leia cinnamon bun hairstyles. Okay, he had these long curls that you look at him and he's got like Princess Leia hair. Okay. Expressing his feminine side. I don't know where that comes into the priesthood. Apparently that was a kind of priestly wear. But the main thing about him, he wore buckle shoes.
Oh.
Now, when did buckle shoes go out of style? Certainly around the time of the Pilgrims. Okay. So something that might have been worn in Salem, okay, something that Goody Garlick's husband might have been walking around in, that's what he was wearing. And he would wear his whole sort of, 18th century priest outfit with buckle shoes and Princess Leia cinnamon bun hair. And he would make his visits to the British Museum, where he would carry out regular studies. And he's often described as walking in and out of the museum carrying a large black case with the word vampires in red letters so that everyone could read. So there's a certain degree of showmanship with what he's doing. And I'd have to suspect that he's writing books on vampires and werewolves because they were kind of popular and they would get readers and he would make money off of them.
Right.
But it's also a way of advertising these things. So what did Summers, and I said that he believed that a witch cult existed, but he didn't see it as a joyous religion in the way that Summers did. He makes a very interesting comment in that he argues that as opposed to being the survival of an ancient fertility religion, as opposed to being a religion devoted to Pan and to the god of nature, he thinks that witchcraft was the debased remnants of what he calls the Manichaean religion. He argues that they're essentially just sort of the last remnants of the Manichees. So what's he talking about? He's actually talking about Cathars. This again takes us off, and at some future episode, I'd like to do something on the Cathars because there's a lot of room for speculation there, if not much. What's generally called Catharism was a widespread and very serious heretical, in the view of the church, challenge to the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. There was a whole crusade carried out against them. Hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered simply on the basis that they might have been. The church went out of its way to destroy this heresy, which took a lot of bloodshed and time to do so. But the interesting thing about the Cathars is that they never used that term for themselves. That came along much later. The term even used at the time for them is that they were Manichees. Mm-hmm. And that had to do with when Christianity was still competing to be top religion for the Roman Empire, one of its competitors was something called Manichaeanism or Manichaeism. And it was another sort of Middle Eastern syncretic faith. The chief prophet was a guy named Mani, hence, Manny, Mo, and Jack. The head of the chief prophet of the Manichaean religion. And the essential point here was that it was a dualistic religion. It believed that there was a good God which existed off, in the pleroma somewhere, never touched earth, had a lot of good intentions, but never did much of anything. And then there was the actual physical world is a prison of souls. Yeah. It is an inherently evil place. Now, that's, if you think about it, is quite different than the religion of Pan about fertility and joy. Right. Because that view accepts that, yes, there's a great deal of, nature is all about killing and eating each other, but it's all for the greater good. It's also, there's a lot of fun involved. It's this playoff one way or the other. That's essentially, in Murray's view, the violence in nature is irrelevant. It's just part of nature. It's just part of the whole process.
Yeah. That's why it sounds to me like one is agrarian, rural, people close to the land, and then one is from civilization. Yeah.
People living in cities.
Yes. Okay,
who think they know everything. Yeah. They live in cities. So they live in a zoo. They live in human zoos.
There you go.
They begin to behave like zoo animals. Which there's a whole thing about that. Oh, yes. The urban zoo. But that the Cathars or Manichaeans viewed that the world itself was really a horrible prison, and all the things that make you feel good just entrap you here.
It's basically Gnosticism is kind of how
Yes,
it's captured.
it often connected. Gnosticism, well, that's one of those words that just means
Anything.
kind of all kinds of stuff. But the dualistic man, and so this is why the reason why the church was so down on the Cathars, or the Manichaeans, was because they argued that the church was the church of the world and that their actual god that they worshipped was the demiurge, the evil god, and that Christ had been sent to try to correct that, and of course they killed him.
Yeah.
And then they built their whole religion around his messy death.
So they were the ones,
And that in fact their mass celebrates his death. It doesn't honor it. It's actually this whole. So the world is satanic. The church is satanic. Everything is evil in it, and we're going to save you by stopping. So just quit having sex, don't have children, and kill yourself.
Well, that works out. Yeah.
Yeah, that was their one of the highest sacraments there was just starving yourself to death, because the whole idea is to escape this prison and go on to the pleroma. Church didn't like that. So how did that get turned into witchcraft? Well, I don't know. But the way that Summers argues is that what happened is that through this persecution by the church, the Manichaean heresy and its dualism, which already viewed the world as essentially a kind of evil place and viewed the church as an evil institution in service of the evil god, that through their persecution, through the murder of their parishioners, through the killing and burning at the stake, they had their own sort of bishops. They had their own. There were Cathar bishops, for instance. There was a much. That really was a kind of organized, as far as we can figure out, really a kind of organized counter-church, which had its own hierarchy, maybe even something equivalent to its own sort of pope, which was one of the things that made it dangerous, that through this persecution, the remnants of that. So what happened was that organization was basically destroyed. Its hierarchy was destroyed. Much of its religious purpose was destroyed. But what survived from that, Summers argued, what survived was a total opposition and hatred of Christianity and the church. That became in every person in society who was connected to that. That is, they became completely alienated from the larger Christian society. And that this residual Manichaeism then simply became a focus of hatred and antagonism, and hence their whole opposite, their emphasis upon just doing harm to things, of disrupting, and thus the witch became a negative figure, because the way in which you showed your loyalty to what remained of your god was to simply do what was considered evil by the larger society, and thus became increasingly negative and debased. Didn't start out that way, but that's what it became. Not really sure whether I buy that, but I think it's an interesting argument that could have been brought in. But it's almost as if, remember, that Summers and Murray are, again, talking about much the same thing and even describe it in similar ways, even though they have a different kind of variation on that. But I still have to wonder there as to whether or not Summers is basically talking about his own beliefs. I mean, that would be remember, it's often said, way too often, is the greatest trick the devil pulls is convincing you that he doesn't exist. And therefore, if Montague Summers was in fact a ordained priest, as he saw it, in the service of Satan, that everything he did in his own way was part of this corrupting influence. The more that he can sell ideas of werewolves. And I think the werewolves and vampire part of it could be arguably just trying to sell something else. But in his condemnation of witchcraft, he also describes it in great detail. So, for instance, he absolutely agrees with Murray that all of the devils or the men in black at witches' sabbats were just people in costumes. They both agree upon that. The other thing, interesting enough, they both agree upon was the prevalent use of poison in witchcraft. So even Margaret says that, Margaret Murray, can't remember her first name, that spells were kind of difficult. Spells require a lot of work. And if you wanted to seek revenge on someone or do harm to someone who had done harm or potentially could do harm to you, it was just a lot easier to poison them. And all of this had to do with it also, remember, throughout much of human history, poison was the easiest way to get away with murder because there were no forensic tests and you couldn't really determine it for the most part. People just got sick and died. They did that all the time. That's why poison was so feared, because it was so difficult to prove. So that poison was so both of them would argue is that very often what was involved wasn't magic. It was just folk chemistry. It was just the manipulation of existing plants in order to come a way that could kill or sicken someone. That's the way you did it. You didn't have to have a spell. You would just do it through poisons. Simpler to manage in that regard. So I think the possibility that Montague Summers was a secret Satanist is not to be completely discounted, and someone should do a biography of him based on that called Montague Summers, Secret Satanist. There's another guy, to show you how all of this sort of continues into the more modern era. There's a name that has become semi-famous. If you look into more modern, and I mean that 19th and 20th century witchcraft, you're going to come across the name of George Pickingill. That's usually spelled Pickingill, but there are all kinds of variations to it because apparently Pickingill wasn't really literate and wrote his name in different ways. Pettigill will sometimes come across. I mean, to me, George Pickingill sounds like a Dickens character. But he actually existed. There was this is what we know. Let's go back again to the fact. A George Pickingill did live through much of the 19th and into the early 20th century in England, particularly in East Anglia, around the little town of Canewdon. Now, given that this is a British place name, I am probably pronouncing it it's Canewdon. Like Canewdon is what American might say, but Canewdon, that might be part of it. But again, this is England. It could be pronounced Tinsley. Who knows? They just spell things one way and pronounce them another. So in this town, he was well known around there as what was termed a cunning man. No one ever said witch. So there were cunning men, there were cunning women. Sometimes they're called clever men, clever women. These are folk magicians. They're the local brujos and brujas. They know about folk medicine. They can treat your animals if they get sick. They can also probably kill them. They're probably well versed in all sorts of poisons that might be the case. And so Pickingill's story was basically popularized by a British occultist and writer named E.W. Liddell in the 1970s. So this is really where the story emerges. So Liddell had sort of discovered the existence of Pickingill, the stories about him being a local cunning man, local warlock, and decided that he must be a card-carrying member of Margaret Murray's Dianic cult. That's what he was. And, of course, an inveterate enemy of all things Christian and the founder of no less than 9 covens that spread across England. So what you'll often read about George Pickingill is that he's kind of the granddaddy, the great father of modern British witchcraft by founding all of these covens. Liddell also credited Pickingill with the foundation of Wicca, that essentially the basis of modern Wicca rests with Pickingill. Now, George Pickingill existed. He lived in East Anglia during most of the period. When he was born, at one point he claimed to be the oldest man in England. He claimed to be something like 116, which seems to be an exaggeration, but he did probably live into his 90s. And what Liddell in 1970 wanted to do was to essentially take Margaret Murray's Dianic witch cult, George Pickingill, and Wicca, which was then emerging as a thing, and combine them all together in a kind of seamless tapestry to connect them together. So George Pickingill existed. It's Liddell who in the 1970s takes his story, such as it is, and then turns him into the founder of Wicca and to, again, the kind of great daddy of modern British witchcraft. Besides Liddell's assertions, there's nothing really to substantiate that. So what are the few other things we know about Pickingill? His reputation as a cunning man was largely based upon him apparently assisting people with things. So one of the things he would do is that people would go to him for favors. Maybe their cows were not doing well, or their chickens were dying, or their crops weren't growing well. And the one thing that he would never do, according to as the story goes, is he would never take money for any kind of favor. So you never paid him for anything. Well, you didn't pay him money, but that's not to say that any of the favors he did you were freebies. More importantly, you were obligated to him, and he would choose how the debt was to be paid. Let's stop again for a moment. Okay. Just a warning here. You may hear panting in the background. It is not imps or devils of any kind. It's just a dog, which is insisting on being here. So remember a scene from The Godfather when it comes to the way in which George Pickingill did business. At one point, the Brando character, remember, he does a favor for a mortician by the name of Bonacera. Does revenge for him. You'd have to see the movie to figure that out. And Bonacera asks how he can repay him. And the Godfather doesn't take any money. He just goes, I've done you a favor, and at some point, and that day may never come, I will ask you to return the favor. And when I do, you must do it in a way in which I will determine. So it's fairly easy to see that George Pickingill used a similar kind of power play. This is one of the ways he gained influence and power in the community, even though he was technically an illiterate farm laborer who nevertheless lived fairly well because he did favors, magical favors for other people, and they owed him, and at a time and place and manner of his choosing, he could call in those debts. Or he could simply have the debt there with the idea that he might call in it at some point. What people never wanted to do was to refuse to pay the debt when it was asked, because the assumption was bad things could happen. Now, whether or not George Pickingill was the head of a coven, that is, a organized group of witches in Canewdon or in East Anglia, is possible. There are also claims that he was essentially a good witch who used part of his influence to keep more malevolent witches in line. That there were people who just did sort of bad things, and he could prevent that from happening. That is, he was a witch who could protect you from other witches. Think of it this way. Take it back again to the realm of the mafia and organized crime. What does a protection racket do? When the Black Hand comes around and offers to protect your business, they are offering to protect your business from people who would do bad things, like burn it down. So if you pay us, we will protect you. If you pay we criminals, we will protect you from other worse criminals. And if you don't pay us, then we'll burn your business down. So that's an interesting way to consider that in some ways Pickingill was running witchcraft as a kind of criminal enterprise, which may have been the way had been done for some time when one could manage to do that. But other than the fact that he existed, exercise was known for his folk magic capabilities in the locality. There's nothing else really to connect him to the creation of Wicca. The background of that is rather different. And I have to say, and this isn't meant to be a dig at any of you Wiccans out there, but it tends to cover a lot of waterfront. And as an example, I have attended 2 Wiccan weddings. Not now, and never have been, and have no desire to be a member, but I somehow knew people and got invited to Wiccan weddings. Figure out how that happened. In one of them, it was like, if anyone is acquainted with the Society for Creative Anachronism, which various perhaps nerdishly inclined people get together and try to act out the Middle Ages, not as it was, but as they would like it to be. Even they admit that. You know, a collection of weird costumes, Renaissance fair, okay, which you take seriously, and undoubtedly today with plastic elf ears adorning many of the females, because somehow plastic elf ears are part of the Middle Ages and are inherently connected to witchcraft. Beyond that, pollution, cultural pollution, but in my humble opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, you've got this idea. The Wiccan wedding, the first one I went to, was just, it was like guys in kilts, women in whatever things they picked up at thrift stores, and you know, and they were drinking what they thought was mead out of you know, various what were probably originally German beer steins. You know, someone had a dulcimer. There was rather unenthusiastic dancing, no fornication that I could see. That was very important. But it was a whole sort of, you know, supposed hand fasting ritual, you know, tie their hands together. They'd gotten that out of a book somewhere. But it was, again, in my humble opinion, a very lame, you know, this was people play acting, for the most part. Some of them might have dabbled in magic on the side, but this was play acting. Was unimpressed. And the other thing, which is often my sort of test, the term is shit test for people who claim to be into this, is to see whether or not they knew who Aleister Crowley was. Now, again, Crowley himself is not a warlock, is only vaguely connected to witchcraft. But he is a seminal figure in sort of modern occultism. And if you're claiming to be someone who is practicing magic and you don't know the name of the guy who wrote Magic in Theory and Practice, you are a poser. So that may be the way to put it, is that Wicca is full of serious people. It's full of a lot of people who are posers. And I'm betting people out there who are Wiccans would probably agree with that. You know who some of those posers are. They're not you. Probably. But other people might think they are. So that was one example of the sort of poser Wiccan wedding. But then the other one I went to was, well, this was much more serious. And the way it was much more serious was that at the culmination of the process, or the near culmination of it, the nuptial couple had sex on the ground in front of the people who were witnessing it.
Wow.
A phenomenal thing. I mean, it was at once embarrassing. I'm not even sure who I was embarrassed for, partly for myself, partly for everyone else, partly for the couple who were bravely attempting to have sex in front of an audience. If you're not into porn, I think that's probably pretty difficult. Okay. If you wanted to have a picture called performance anxiety, and you wanted to picture that, I'm not sure. They soldiered through. But that took a certain amount of dedication. Okay, that took, you know, those were people who took what they were doing more seriously. I don't remember whether there were cakes of light there, which are things that are often, always be careful if you're offered a cake of light at some sort of ceremony, because it could be just, I don't know, Betty Crocker, but it could also include semen and menstrual blood. That's one of the key elements there. Do you want to eat that? Maybe you do. Maybe it's an important ritual thing. I don't remember them having that, but I would, in comparing those two things, that's the kind of spectrum in Wicca, in my experience. People who take this quite seriously and are willing to have sex on the ground in front of other people, and those who dance around in kilts and also had a flowing chocolate fountain, which looked very, I don't know what that was doing there. Destroyed the whole, the whole atmosphere was wiped out by the chocolate fountain. Because I'm pretty sure that none of Margaret Murray's witch cult people were going to have a chocolate fountain, or maybe they would. So
earthly delights, right?
Who am I? That is earthly delights. So perhaps that is a part of it, but it doesn't work for me. So it covers a wide spectrum. Now, the guy who basically invented Wicca, and this may come as a disappointment, but it may have some sort of traces to primordial, feminine, magical, matriarchal, practice. I doubt it. Because the guy who came up with it, and it's a guy, is Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner was a British occultist. He sort of knocked around, eventually decided he was going to become a magician. Around 1946, he befriended a dying Aleister Crowley. So Crowley is very sick at this time. He's broke. Crowley needs money. He gets free heroin from the government, but nevertheless, he's in bad states. And so what Gardner would sometimes describe himself as Crowley's assistant or a secretary, and I think he's just making this up. Gardner was interested in creating some kind of organization of his own, and he purchased from Crowley the rights to certain rituals and titles. This is one of the things, there's a kind of business in occultism in which if you have titles or you have control of certain rituals and materials, you can kind of sell or license them. So what Crowley thought he was doing is he was selling a license to perform these rituals or to use these titles. And that, even according to people like one of Gardner's early associates and one of the most famous British modern witches, Diane Valiente, would admit that Gardner basically picked up some stuff from Crowley. He bought some stuff off of Crowley when he was sick and in need of money. And then he borrowed other things from Freemasonry and from the OTO and other organizations. And he just cobbled together a bunch of rituals that eventually became a thing called the Book of Shadows, which is not some ancient tome of witch lore, but is pretty much a kind of modern recreation. And by the way, within occultism, this is commonplace. It's always the process of syncretization, of taking things of different sources, recombining them, maybe to reform what always existed, or maybe to come up with something new. But Gerald Gardner basically cobbled together a lot of bits and pieces of magical or traditional or more high occult practices, and then called it Wicca, gave it a backstory, and he did that to have something to sell. It was more, and then that's been taken up by other people. So you've got Gardnerian Wicca, you've got Alexandrian Wicca, you've got Arcadian Wicca. I think there are different, people come up with different versions of it. There's some versions that are all female, some that are, more mixed. You can just make this stuff up any way that you want. That's one of the advantages of this, is that you can form it, in the same way that Margaret Murry might argue that the witch cult covens of 17th century England could all have different variations because there was nothing enforcing this kind of uniformity, even though if there was a kind of underlying uniformity of belief and practice which is involved. So it's the same story as everything else. It's a combination of old and new. It's the reinvention or the recreation of things that did exist, or using things that did exist to imagine and recreate something to project an image into to manifest into reality. You're talking about Druidism. Well, what were the Druids? The Druids were some sort of ancient Celtic priestly class, a sort of class of arguably priests are
Yeah.
magicians, so that's what they are, which the Romans systematically destroyed and which people have been trying to reinvent ever since. Do we really know exactly what the Druids believed? No. Do we know exactly what they did? No. But we know that there were Druids and they were cool and they practiced magic. So we'll just get some magic stuff and we'll call ourselves Druids. So modern Druidism, there are different Druid societies. Those began to reform late 18th century. And then there were other iterations in the 1920s. Every time you turn around, somebody's claiming to be. You go to Stonehenge at different times of the year, and there are people there dressed up in costumes claiming to be Druids. Are they? Well, by their terminology, they are, because they've just decided what Druids are. But that doesn't necessarily mean it has any contact what was there previously. And that, on this windy October day, would perhaps seem to be an interesting place to leave the discussion. And as ever, it's a matter of, well, what's real and what's made up? Well, it all is. Both of them at the same time. Because once you've made it up, once you've put it out there, it's real.